Guy joins us from the United States and has been a student of Dr. Wolf Wolfensberger, is a member of the American Council, is a teacher of SRV, and is closely allied to vulnerable people. Guy had intended to be co-presenting the paper with Joe Osborne, who's known and affectionately known to many of us. Joe is currently recovering from surgery and can't join us, but in contributing to the paper, he draws on his many years of experience in working alongside families and people with disabilities and his teaching of SRV. So Guy and Joe's paper is called Best Practice, May Jeopardise Getting the Good Life If Not Understood from an SRV Perspective. A great start to the conference. So can I ask you to make Guy welcome? Thank you.
Well, good morning and welcome to everyone. My name is Guy Caruso, and it's my great pleasure to have been asked by the conference committee to present the opening keynote for this, the 5th International Social Role Valorization Conference. It's an honor to be here with you. It's been a lifelong dream of mine to come to Australia, along with so many longtime friends and colleagues, and hopefully new ones yet to be made. As Jane said, Joe was unable to join us, but he sends his warm regards and best wishes to everyone. Now, way back in 1974, as a graduate student at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York, I first became aware of Dr. Wolf Wolfensberger and his Training Institute for Human Service Planning, Leadership, and Change Agentry, where I also later worked for him on a project called PEP, the Pennsylvania Evaluation Project, where we use PASS to do many evaluations in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, I've used Wolfensberger's normalization, social role valorization, and other teachings all through my professional career as a rehabilitation counselor in vocational settings, as a residential director, in my many years of consulting work, and also as a member of the SRV Development, Training, and Safeguarding Council. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Wolfensberger's editing help to Joe Osborne and myself in writing an article related to this topic, which, as will be no surprise if you've ever had anything edited by Wolf, took a long time and eventually became 3 articles instead of 1, and thankfully these are now in print. Now, in my presentation, I hope to make the case that some things that are called best practices in human services, especially in the areas of individualization, autonomy and rights, and relationships, are actually closely connected to normalization and SRV. And that pursuing those best practices in isolation from SRV is less fruitful, even confusing, and may jeopardize getting the good things of life. The basic premise of SRV is that people are much more likely to experience the good things in life if they are in valued roles. So the definition of SRV could be paraphrased to say the pursuit of the good things in life for people via the pursuit of valued social roles for them. Now, how life's good things are tied to valued roles for valued people was identified explicitly in an article in which many of you have read and no doubt memorized by Wolfensberger, Thomas, and yours truly, entitled Some of the Universal Good Things of Life, which the implementation of social role valorization can be expected to make more accessible to the valued people. Now, the 17 good things of life recognized in this article are as follows, and since this conference is about this, it's important that we stand back and look at what it is that we're trying to accomplish in this good life. So family, a place to call home, belonging to an intermediate but still relatively small scale social body, friends, a transcendent belief system, work, absence of imminent threats of extreme privation and of violent death, safety and security, opportunities and expectations, to be viewed as human and treated with at least a basic level of respect, to be dealt with honestly, a reasonable assurance that one will not be a victim of gross injustice, as Wolf called it, a fair shake, being treated as an individual, having a say in important decisions affecting one's own life, access to at least many of the sites of conduct of everyday life, access to at least many of the ordinary activities of human social life, being able to contribute, and good health. Now, also, our Australian friend and fellow SRV teacher and writer, John Armstrong, has written in the most recent issue of the SRV Journal, this is a plug for the journal, okay, that achieving the good things in life is dependent on the presence of others. Some who do things for you, others who do things with you, some who just believe in you, encourage you, offer you love and affection. It occurs in the shared space of life where we all spend our time, and not in a managed life where only basic needs get met and cannot be imposed but must be embraced by a person. You have to want it. I remember about Peter, a good friend of mine, who had lived in institutions and in community residences. We had gotten Peter a job, and Peter kept self-destructing on the job because Peter really didn't want a job at that point in life. We sort of imposed it upon him. We had made decisions for Peter way ahead of time. So again, he didn't embrace the world of work at that juncture in time. Another friend that I had served, Kathy, who lived in our community residence, said to me and to the staff who lived with her that she wanted to live on her own. And I had a mental checklist in my head of all the things you need to do before you can live on your own. And Kathy wasn't nearly close to doing any of those things. But Kathy really wanted to live on her own. She embraced the concept. And thank goodness I listened to the staff who knew her best. And Kathy moved into her own place. And all these years later, is still living a very happy life in the community. And every time I would see Kathy, she would punch me to say, "You didn't believe I could do it." Okay? She embraced the idea of the good life. And it makes a big difference when a person embraces it versus it being imposed upon them. Now, one of the things I found of interest in John's article was his discussion of first and second order preferences. He notes that first order preferences of most people are driven by the media in the marketplace and are mostly about the self, about me, me, me. These can preoccupy us and become compulsions. So it is not surprising that things like rights, choice, and independence are touted as paramount, even best practices for people with disabilities. However, John notes that with experience, self-control, and help from others, we develop second-order preferences, which are the ones that bring to ourselves and to others long-term benefit, including, of course, the good things in life. Now, in his article, John poses two questions that are of paramount importance for everyone who is part of the SRV movement. He asks, first, do you really want the people you support to have the good things in life? It's an important question. We can't presume that everybody working human services is there for that reason. A second question, are you willing to do what it takes to make this happen? Are you willing to do what it takes? Reminds me of the as much as possible in the normalization definition, and the bending over backwards, which we see in the conservatism corollary, the real effort that it entails to really do what's best to help people have the good things in life. It's so easy to make the first order preferences. The market society tells us that a person's rights are everything, that independence is paramount, having one's own place, own home is ultimate. A human service culture is typically one of quick fixes, the least exertion, what's the latest rage, perhaps what has even been labeled as the best practice. The leadership that is needed is ethical leadership, as John says. Ethical leaders will be an example of second-order preferences. Now, if you accept the basic premise of SRV, that the good things in life are much more likely to be experienced, so this is a third question I'm posing to you, do you think the pursuit of valued social roles on behalf of people you care about is accomplished more effectively via SRV or by some other means, such as so-called best practice? So those are three questions for you to think on. Now, to help you contemplate this issue, I will now offer a few reflections on the best practice concept. Let me begin by noting that I first heard the term best practice in the early 1980s in a conversation with a friend who had some SRV training. She referred to an independent living project as best practice, and I well remember being struck by this, not by the new term so much as by hearing someone who knew SRV referring to something other than SRV as best practice. I had always believed SRV was the best, but never called it that, or heard anyone else refer to it in that way. So finally, 30 years later, I get to talk with someone, you, about this traumatic experience. My main intent this morning is to explore the relationship between SRV and at least some best practices in pursuit of the good things in life for devalued people. To set the stage for that, I'll offer a brief critique of best practice, the term, how it gets used, and the concept itself, because I think that there's a number of big drawbacks that those who see or use it might want to be aware of. Best practice is a very popular term in the English language. It gets attached to all kinds of ideas, technologies, processes, procedures, and so on. It has become a catchphrase, so elastic that hundreds and hundreds of things are called best practice. It is used and misused pervasively in a vast array of disciplines, ranging from agriculture to Zymergy, which is a brewing of beer, which I've enjoyed in Australia. Here is a sampling of those. So again, these are just a generic sampling of how things have been referred to as best practices. So not surprisingly, it entered the human services vernacular in very short order. And since then, many different types of ideas, technologies, processes, and services began to be called best practices, not just in the ordinary discourse, such as at informal conversations, meetings, and conferences, but also in the professional literature, where you'd have national magazines touting best practices. Now, early on, being called a best practice had a progressive aura about it, but its overuse has drained it, even when perhaps deservedly applied, of much of the distinctiveness it once had. At one time, a service receiving a best practice award may have felt a bit like winning an Oscar, but now it's more like getting a simple pat on the back. Yet, despite popular usage, it's a pretty fuzzy concept and an imprecise term. One clear indication of this is that it has scores of different definitions and descriptions. One author noted that what is a best practice depends on the particular context and in particular circumstances of particular persons and particular incidences. While this assertion has some validity, it pretty much implies that there can be a zillion different best practices, even within a particular field. Quite often, the term itself does not reveal the nature, scope, or utility of the thing it is used in reference to. This is because very different kinds of human service entities are given the name best practice. For example, it is commonly attached to highly generalized concepts and service themes such as diversity or inclusion. However, it gets applied to thousands of small-scale routine service functions. Even what is nothing more than a rudimentary list of steps for carrying out a very ordinary task, like filling out an eligibility form, may be called the best practice for doing so, which can be a bit grandiose. Now, here is a simple sample list of human service activities that exemplifies what I mean. As you see, there are best practices ranging from injecting people with needles to exhibiting exemplary human service policies. So again, this is just a short list of things that we've seen called best practices in human services. Now, an obvious drawback is that calling something a best practice may simply be incorrect because it may not be that at all in reality. It might not even be a good one. However, if something is labeled a best practice, its bestness may be indiscriminately accepted by many people at face value, as a stamp of approval, without regard to its limits, or whether it has any shortcomings at all, which may not be fully acknowledged, even known by its leading proponents. I remember attending conferences on self-determination, where only the concept's praises were sung, with no critical analysis of any possible shortcomings, limitations, or drawbacks. It's a best practice. There can be nothing wrong with it. So no discussion at all of anything that might have a limitation, a problem. And presenting those drawbacks, limitations, did make me a very popular conference attendee. Referring something as a best practice is grammatically awkward, since in common parlance, people usually do not say that something is a best, but rather that it is the best, meaning that they may think it is definitely better than the other contenders. The best is the best. Saying that something is a best implies that there is not one best, but rather many bests, depleting the concept of its impact, if not also of some of its meaning. Is something the best or not? Are many things equally the best? Does best only mean that a practice is one of several good, best ones? A human service practice may be proclaimed best without ever passing a clear performance test to verify that claim. By contrast, in other fields of human endeavor, the claim that something is the best is credibly demonstrated. The field of athletics is a clear-cut example of this point. Only teams or individuals that prove that they are the best by establishing a new records of performance and are actually besting all the other contenders in a competition can credibly claim to be the best or to be number one. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The Steelers have won 6 Super Bowls. We are the best, okay? Sorry, New England, okay? Soccer, you've got the World Cup. Your Rugby World Cup is going on equally as well. And those Irish are looking pretty darn good right now. Therefore, a best practice claim in human services can be very unconvincing in the absence of genuine assessments of its quality of service, design, and performance. A great many organizations profess adherence to SRV, yet few ever undertake competent training in SRV or submit themselves to rigorous external evaluation by means of any recognized SRV-based service evaluation tools such as passing. Considerable skepticism is the only appropriate stance in regard to rhetoric about best practices from individuals and services that never, and I mean never, submit the best practice to scrutiny sufficient to disclose the actual facts about it. I know few of any services, at least in the state of Pennsylvania, where I hail from right now, that ever do an external evaluation, that ever actually look at what they're doing, really get a sense of what is best, but oftentimes the word best practice is thrown out as we are the best, but it's never tested. It's not genuine. After all, when something else is extolled as best practice, who would want to claim to be doing anything less? Who would claim theirs is a mediocre or pedestrian practice, not to mention a bad one, even if it were? Different fields of human service have their own sets of best practices, yet having such a particularized best practices carries an implication that there is no high-order principle involved that would make a strategy a best practice across the board, from field to field, and service type to service type. However, there are indeed such high-level principles and strategies that apply to virtually all types of human services and that would be universally beneficial in all these fields. For example, a strong sense of interpersonal identification between the server and the served, holding and conveying positive, high expectations of the party served, encountering negative stereotypes to which the party may be vulnerable, and all other high-level principles and strategies that comprise SRV. Others, too, have recognized problems with the facile usage of the best practice and become seriously engaged with the question of applied strategies having a respectable empirical basis. This seems to account for some parties increasingly expressing preference for such terms as evidence-based practice, science-based practice, promising practices, leading practice, good practices, or the appealingly modest, probably effective practices. And others like them largely as correctives to the many shortcomings in best practice. However, while many other terms and concepts may seem to improve upon best practice by having more apparent precision and tangible backup, they still do not necessarily escape all the shortcomings that are inherent in the best practice terminology, and even have their own different drawbacks. The need for a new corrective to the previous corrective always seems to arise. Recognizing this, some experts in the field of drug rehabilitation call for combining evidence-based practice with practice-based evidence. That is, what practitioners can document from their own work. However, judging the quality of a practice on the basis of its outcome or backup proof is only as good as the quality of the outcome or evidence itself, which may not be good at all, let alone the best. In fact, it might be bad. As one author noted, mere insertion of the phrases evidence-based or best practice as modifiers and our claims about services means little. Such evidence as we have is not always clear. Much of it changes, sometimes radically. Some evidence turns up in places we didn't expect. Of course we want the evidence, but it's never all in, and we'll always have to keep looking. In fact, the best practice may be contrary to evidence, so that there is a disconnect between the evidence and claims of best practice. A best practice assertion may be made solely based on whatever a certain ideology holds to be desirable. For instance, within the self-determination ideology, the promotion of choice and self-adequacy were hailed as best practices. Analysis of evidence was not considered relevant. And my good friend Chris Layuzo, who directs a large residential program in upstate New York, would always say, "Show me the evidence." Directors would sing their praises about the work they do in their agencies, praises about people living alone or having a job in the community. But a closer examination, those folks living alone oftentimes are lonely, afraid, harmed, isolated. Folks who had jobs, when you looked at the evidence, they worked 2 hours a week. So the rest of the week they sat bored to tears in their rooms. Those agencies write books, talk about the best practice. But the evidence, when it's really looked at, wouldn't really prove that. Also, it should be noted that the best practice for doing a certain thing is often spelled out in the absence of any claim that the thing itself is the best practice. For instance, best practices have been specified for some pretty questionable or otherwise devalorizing human service approaches, things such as pet-centered therapy, application of restraints, and giving people lethal injections. The implication is that it is okay to do weird or harmful things to people as long as they are done according to the best practices for doing them. We wouldn't be at all surprised to learn that there are also best practices for torturing people. For example, what some people have said has taken place for many years at the Judge Rottenberg Center in Massachusetts in the United States, formerly the Behavior Research Institute. Furthermore, when we look at the history of practically any field of applied practice, we can see examples of abysmal practices that were considered and called best by many people in the field. In fact, some noble practices, once for which the inventors or formulators were awarded a Nobel Prize, ended up being horrors. For example, in 1927, Julius Wagner Jauregg, a neurologist, was awarded a Nobel Prize in medicine for inventing the practice of injecting psychiatric patients with malaria to induce high fever and convulsions, the first use of so-called shock therapy. Following his lead, others invented and applied such psychiatric treatments as insulin shock therapy and insulin-induced coma therapy. In 1949, a Nobel Prize was awarded to the inventor of lobotomy. 2 other Nobel nominees invented electroshock or electroconvulsive therapy. The later 3 treatments are still with us. More recently, the widely accepted critical incident stress debriefing that is used in situations of apprehended psychological trauma has been found to do more harm than good sometimes. Again, the evidence piece of it. But nevertheless, they all got Nobel Peace Prizes. Okay? Now, there are many other illustrative examples. And lastly on this point, it seems a bit ironic to us that SRV, so far as we know, has not been called a best practice. However, an organization here in Australia came close to doing that by incorporating a range of what it called better practices, of which commendably SRV was clearly the unifying framework. It published a handbook that contains a chapter on the good things in life, another crucial element, in fact, the ultimate goal of SRV. Now, I'm not really concerned this morning with the crucial question of whether something called a best practice actually is best or even valid, but with the fact that some meritorious best practices are derived from, inspired by, or congruent with the principle of normalization and social role valorization, but without being referenced to either. Actually, it seems doubtful that SRV congruent best practices were separately embedded in their own right, because their basic concepts are clearly preconceived and pre-developed in normalization and SRV, from which these best practices seem to emerge later as organic outgrowths. It's true, of course, that something that comes chronologically after another is not necessarily derived from it. However, the evidence for derivation mounts when the first thing is truly pragmatic, high-level, complex, comprehensive, and widely influential, as was Wolfensberger normalization and is now SRV, and especially when the second thing is very similar to or an elaboration of an explicit component of the first thing. Furthermore, a number of these best practices were invented after their inventors were first trained in normalization or SRV. So even if one were to disagree that a best practice was derived directly from normalization and or SRV, or that it was in fact preceded and assumed by SRV and normalization, one might at least acknowledge the obvious congruency between the best practice and certain elements, though not the whole, of SRV. Now, 3 other strong indicators of congruency are the following. The passing evaluation instrument, with its hierarchy of 42 differently weighted ratings, illustrates both the multifaceted nature of SRV as well as the subordinate nature of many best practices within SRV's more comprehensive framework. In other words, it is quite apparent that SRV in passing and normalization in pass already cover many best practices. Even the names given to some approaches that we later refer to as best practices are very similar to the titles of some ratings in the normalization and SRV service evaluation tools pass and passing, which preceded them. It is easy to see how labeling and language-oriented best practices are very similar to the title of the passing rating of image projection of personal labeling practices. Also, the many approaches addressing self-determination, rights, autonomy, empowerment, choice, and control are very similar to the passing rating called promotion of recipient autonomy and rights. In addition, there are many approaches today about individualized funding, plans, supports, and services that are very similar to the passing rating title of service support for recipient individualization. Likewise, we find that many best practices are substantially included in one or more of the 10 core themes of SRV. This is apparent not only in similarities between the names of certain themes and certain best practices, but even more so between their essential ideas and thrusts. For example, concepts of independence, personal growth, development, increasing skills and competencies are certainly similar to the SRV theme, personal competency enhancement. Also, concepts of inclusion, integration, mainstreaming, belonging, community involvement, participation are similar to the SRV theme, personal social integration, and valued social and societal participation. And thirdly, some best practices are nearly exclusively oriented to the address of particular ones of the common wounds of the valued people that have long been a fundamental part of SRV teaching. For instance, the wounds of exclusion and distanciation on the one hand, and various participation-oriented best practices such as inclusion, networking, and natural supports on the other. To illustrate these ties a bit further, we note that quite a few best practices are built on the idea of individualization of processes around specific people, such as such as all of the many so-called individual funding, individual or independent living, recipient-directed initiatives, and individual service planning schemes, including person-centered planning. In regard to these, it is important to point out that individualization of service is one prominent notion, but only one of many in what SRV has to say about personal competence enhancement, in the constructs of service relevance, service potency, the development model, and model coherency of services. Also, as early as the 1973 second edition of PASS, individualization was one, but highly weighted, of 50 service ratings. In passing, first published in 1983, it is a concern of 2 of the 42 service quality ratings. Now, in regard to person-centered planning specifically, O'Brien and O'Brien presented an extensive chronology of how normalization and PASS influenced person-centered planning. It's out of Origins of Person-Centered Planning in 2002. It's important to note that its inventors did not themselves call it a best practice. By the way, it should be noted that such an explicit acknowledgement by the O'Briens, the connection to normalization is the exception, not the rule. So many of us hear person-centered planning and assume it's its own thing. But many of us who've been in the field for a long time see its roots coming out of much of what we did in PASS and passing workshops. But no credence is given to that or recognition that that's where people sort of first learned some of these ideas and later on went on to develop things like person-centered planning. Now, in regard to the congruency between SRV and various autonomy and rights-oriented best practices, such as the recipient-directed service models, empowerment, self-determination, choice, it's important to point out that long before these arrived on the scene, they were prefigured in normalization and later SRV, which espoused the concept of supporting adaptive autonomy and rights. Bent Nierge, one of the fathers of normalization, and thus the grandfather of SRV, was a pioneer nearly 40 years ago in writing on and setting up the concept of self-determination for mentally retarded people, but within the context of normalization. Actually, it was a chapter in the normalization book. And yet many people nowadays think that self-determination is a much more recent idea. And no one Very few people ever mention Nietzsche as being really the developer of that concept back in Scandinavia. Without going into further examples, we believe that anyone familiar with SRV can easily see how many best practices are congruent with it. With that in mind, we move to the question of why it is important to be aware of this. And that is because SRV congruent best practices are often perceived, promoted, and pursued in isolation from, and even in ignorance of social role valorization. And we think there are many drawbacks to doing so, as we'll now explore. Even SRV congruent best practices with very positive features are almost certain to be narrower in scope and balance of address than SRV because SRV is a very high-order schema. This reality is over and above what other inherent limits such as best practices may have, either in concept or in practice or both. They may address possibly some aspects, either image or competency, the two dominant avenues to valued social roles, but rarely both. And almost always on the level of the individual, though sometimes also the family, and in only one or few areas of need. Now, this issue is also apparent in the cafeteria approach some people have to SRV, picking only one or a few small pieces, like leaving behind all the other crucial elements of SRV. Our widely traveled and much esteemed colleague, Michael Kendrick, comments on this picking and choosing problem. This is what Michael had to say. Some SRV adherents have unduly emphasized one element of the theory that appealed to them and ignored others. For instance, some people emphasize its emphasis on individual change and ignore its extensive address of change at the community and systems level. Others have emphasized only one feature of SRV consideration, such as choice, rights, inclusion, social image transformation, and so on, without properly grasping that the theory has always argued for the balancing of multiple well-being related considerations, particularly as issues are played out in terms of the specific needs and identity of each person concerned. So again, the picking and choosing. To continue, the fullness of SRV thus remains undisclosed to people who get exposed only to the favored element, but not to the rest of SRV. One example is glossing over or omitting the facts SRV conveys about the lamentable estate of socially devalued people. SRV provides a compelling analysis of the common devalorizing, role-degrading, and wounding life experiences of society devalued people. Once people are exposed to this analysis, they tend to have a much better appreciation of the real and actual life situations and risk status of the valued persons. In our opinion, such an exposure is essential to formulating effective measures and even the motivation to address this wounding, which is the point of teaching about these common wounding experiences in SRV training. However, some people engaged in best practices are silent about social devaluation, and some or all of its wounding manifestations. Some people even deny social devaluation. Others may identify one or two specific wounding patterns, for example, labeling or exclusion, that are directly addressed by their best practice, but without ever explicitly articulating or teaching about or addressing the others, which is tantamount to depreciating their importance, even relevance, or even existence. When an SRV congruent best practice is disconnected from a larger conceptual schema, it is often invested by its practitioners with a disproportionate amount of importance, even displaces other valuable or higher order service technologies, and it is almost bound to result in the provision of incomplete, imbalanced, and incoherent service measures, which is a disservice to such wounded persons. For instance, the best practice of home ownership may be for many people the fulfillment of an improbable dream, but it may not be the best practice for those who need a true home, more than they need home ownership. Okay? People might need friends, people to have as roommates, someone to talk to have a meal with, but you go live by yourself in isolation. Or people may get so fixated on the technology of carrying out a best practice with a person, for example, some kind of behavioral intervention strategy, that they are not at all attuned to such crucial matters as enhancing the imagery that surrounds that person, eliciting and supporting other adaptive relationships with the person, or supporting the person in valued social roles. You get stuck in your behavioral intervention technique, strategy, but you miss out on all the other important components. Relatedly, decontextualization of an alleged best practice often opens the door to the mentality that if one employs a best practice, then one does not need to do much else. After all, one's already doing the best. For example, supported employment was touted in the U.S. as a way to get employment for people, particularly people with significant disabilities. It often did so. But also, what it wound up doing oftentimes is that people would get a job in supported employment and self-destruct. There's a great book by Brzezinski called Methods of Madness, that people would do things to wind up back in the sheltered workshop. They would blow up on the job, not do the job, show up late, when they could, in fact, do the job. But the folks about supported employment were all about the work, but not about the other aspects of work, which is friends, relationships, what to do on the job. So they sort of missed the boat. They didn't get the full picture. SRV as a whole is not immune to entropy and distortion, but we believe it is resistant to formalization, a major source of these. One reason bureaucratic systems are less likely to find SRV attractive is that it is both complex to learn and challenging to implement. However, what is more vulnerable to degradation are fragmented and isolated pieces of normalization in SRV because they are easier to manipulate by formal structures. Even good human service concepts often get perverted or distorted. Typically, their doom is sealed when they get snatched up and legitimatized by the service supersystem and its regulations, funding stipulations, and other power structures. This is especially likely to happen if a practice is perceived as popular, easy to implement, and having a whole-scale transferability and applicability. The problem is that these institutionalizing processes almost always deaden the spirit of such a practice and the joy of doing it. It is virtually certain to get deformed, distorted, or perverted and to end up a soulless, formalistic mandate implemented fruitlessly by uncomprehending practitioners. This is what clearly and quickly happened, for example, with the important SRV and normalization sub-principle of individualization referred to earlier. It was appropriated by service systems practically everywhere, quickly objectified into required formulaic individual service plans, or ISPs, and recapitulated in many permutations as the individual education plans, individual family service or support plans, individual rehab plans, and so on, even to the point that computers could spit out your individual program plan. Coinciding with the spread of mandated individual planning was a separate but related development of person-centered planning, also derived from the idea of individualization and practiced under a number of variations and names. It quickly became seen in some places as a system change technology and in others as a cost-saving mechanism. However, in the process, the spirit and intent of individualization got lost, and in essence, it became coerced and regimented individualization, which even some person-centered planning founders, O'Brien speaks to this, and practitioners have decried as being in reality system-imposed paperwork and procedures applied to individuals. Another example of an institutionalized best practice is that of so-called inclusion, at least certain species of which are degraded forms of what SRV terms is called personal social integration and valued social and societal participation. Some inclusion is in reality legally enforced but unwanted and resented physical presence of the intended beneficiaries, coupled with their de facto social isolation, non-participation, and friendlessness. Because SRV is firmly grounded in empiricism, the more distance in an SRV-derived best practice is from SRV, the more likely it is to lose this groundedness. Some contemporary best practices in human services are even derivations of SRV. For instance, the contemporary insistence on using people-first language can be said to have been derived from normalization, call for positive forms of imaging, personal address, and labeling practices, which got transmuted through self-advocacy and other elements of the disability rights movement. And Wolf has written a lengthy article on this whole discussion of language issues. Or an idea originally embedded in normalization in SRV is taken on with a new fervor and given a new twist which obscures the connection to SRV and normalization and is perhaps even antagonistic to them. The contemporary orientation self-determination mentioned earlier is an example of this. In best practices derived from normalization and SRV theories, if best practices derived from normalization and SRV theories are distanced from their context, they are highly likely to become what Kendrick has called theory fragments. Now, even in a short period of time, the original intent of a best practice can get lost through the processes of co-optation or railroaded away by uninitiated adherents or unrecognized opponents. Some people who early on promoted a specific SRV congruent element, which eventually broke off into a narrow best practice, have written on how difficult it is to control its hijacking by others, and how their original meanings and intents can be so changed as to no longer be what they meant them to be. And again, many feel that the idea of person-centered planning has been so hijacked and really has lost its meaning in many ways. Now, SRV is certainly not invulnerable to it as well. Safeguarding against such degradation is one reason for the existence of the North American Social Role Development Training and Safeguarding Council. Well, some final comments about best practice. In summary, it should be concerned that the best practice dynamic on a field may divert a significant portion of people from engaging in learning or applying SRV. Why go to SRV? I can go to the best practice events. Surface workers may all too often learn and apply a single best practice when instead of a broader, more extensive approach in thinking is what is really required to more comprehensively address the complex issues and situations that impact the valued people. For example, a major advocacy body, the ARC in the United States, endorses the best practice of people-first language, and even has a campaign against the R word. Okay? Yet does little, if anything, to address the issue of over 90% of children with Down syndrome being aborted. So it's easy to talk about language, but much harder to address the realities of the death-making of people with disabilities. The limited resources and time that service providers have available to train staff may be another reason why best practice approaches seem desirable to them. However, historically, it was the very investment in normalization of social role valorization that motivated and prepared people for engaging in the major change from institutional community services. Clearly, I believe continuing the culture of in-depth SRV training is required to address the needs of people now in the community whose lives are not as meaningful as they or their families would like them to be. To really get the good things in life, single-path solutions just will not do it. Now, on this point, I would like to leave you with some words from Dr. Wolfensberger, who often cautioned us about the challenge and importance of preserving SRV. He wrote, "What is universally valid for human service will keep coming back in some form or another, though often in forms not recognized as embodying the same valid principles as earlier forms. Unfortunately, the validities do not often come back all at once and or in organized, cohesive conceptual systems like SRV. Thus, even when SRV dies out entirely, something else good that embodies at least a few of the same things embodied in SRV will be invented, assuming there remains any society and any human services for this successor thing to be embedded in and for. This implies that the maintenance of SRV as a unitary, cohesive, valid theory for however long that might be managed depends on the small band of people who have grasped it in its entirety and teach it as such. When they die out, or should they withdraw from the challenge, the service field would regress to its chronic, undifferentiated state of fragments of theory, crazes, fund-sucking practices, for as long as there is funds to be sucked, and flailing at problems. And this prediction is a best-case scenario, in a sense, because things could be infinitely worse. This makes it all the more important that a group of people committed to seek and teach the valid principles in human services cultivate a preservation and propagation of SRV, and that such a group constantly seek to recruit younger replacements for itself. We all know that it's very hard and sacrificial work, that nothing but a commitment to human service truths and empathy with wounded people can sustain it. Thank you.